Hello, it's Peter Temple here, the Truth Sage. And this is a presentation that I have been working on for the last little while because I think it's important to understand what's going on today. And if I go back through history to a similar period, the pattern is exactly the same. I want to go back to the late 1500s and 1600s, which was the time of Queen Elizabeth I. And I thought we'd do a really deep dive into that period. It was only about 100 years that I'm talking about, maybe 150 if you consider the Maunder minimum, which it sort of slid into. It got colder and drier towards the end of that period. But if you take that whole 150 years together, it's the same thing that we're going through now, except that that was a 172-year cycle top, and this is a 1,000-year cycle top. So it means that the period we're going through now is a lot more intense. And let me tell you, you are going to learn some things in the next month, but let's say later on this year, and over the next, say, 10 years, that is going to be absolutely shocking. Because that's the period that we're in. We're at a cycle top, and the world is going to change dramatically. It's actually a very exciting time to be alive. So with all of that said, let's go look at some of the things that I talked about. I'll just go back to where we began in part number 1, just to do a little bit of a catch-up. And I introduced you to Raymond H. Wheeler. I have all of his charts that go right back to the climate charts, that go right back to the time of Egypt, some of the later dynasties of Egypt. And most of his work, the really intense part in climate, started in 600 BC, which was just a little bit before the time of Sparta, and ended up in about the 1940s. And I've continued some of that work into today. So the part 2 that I'm going to do after this, and I hope to get that out later on this week, will take you through the latest, sort of the last 200 years, 300 years, up to today's date. And also we'll look at the stock market. But let's go back to the time of Elizabeth. And this is the work of Dr. Raymond H. Wheeler and some of the additional work that I've done. And what he did was he figured out the climate over that 2,000-year period, and also the climate. When I say climate, I mean both temperature and rainfall, because they kind of follow each other, but they go in cycles. They go in up and down cycles, so it's like a sine wave. And he figured out all of the major events of all of that time period, that 2,000 years, and they all fit the same cycles up and down. You see the same traits at a cycle top as you do in the next cycle top. And the smaller cycle tops have those same traits, but to a lesser degree. So this is a huge turn that we're going to have in terms of what's happening in the world. And so I'm just going to give you something he said as a thought for you. The current convulsion that we're going through right now, you can think of it as a convulsion, is comparable to the birth of Christianity. That was in the time, or just after the time, of Julius Caesar, about, let's say, 80 AD. Christianity in the 1st century, and to the birth of the modern nation as a feudal principality in the 9th and 10th centuries. Okay, so you can think of that as 1,000 years later. All of these reorganizations of society were marked by spurts in the evolution of democratic institutions. Well, we don't have that today. What we have today is the opposite of that. We have all of this tyranny, but it's going to change very dramatically over the next period, and we're going to move towards much more freedom and democracy. And in fact, our financial situation is going to change dramatically. We're going to go into a debt jubilee, which means that all of your debts are going to go away, and with that, probably taxes in a lot of nations around the world. But it's going to start with the empire that is the empire of the day, which is the United States. So what we're going through right now is the typical hot, dry cycle top, but this is at a 1,000-year cycle top, and this is the largest, pretty well the largest cycle that we would have. And so we're having a period where we have very high government debt. We have financial inequality. You know about the 1% and the 99%, and I imagine you're part of the 99%. We have no money because it's all been stolen from us, and our currency right now is worth about 4 cents to the dollar as to what it was 100 years ago. That's all going to change, and it's going to start to move in the other direction. We have tyranny, for example. They've taken away our freedom. We have socialism, which we always have at these cycle tops. Palace intrigue. Well, you can think of the top of Rome. We have got Julius Caesar, of course, that was assassinated. If you know what's happening right now in the U.S., Donald Trump has had 6 attempts to assassinate him over the period of his time in office. And in fact, he's still in office because the U.S. is under military rule right now. And he will be inaugurated again on March the 9th or March the 4th. But that's another story. And we'll leave that for another video. I am going to talk about a little bit about that as we go forward here, because you can see these patterns that happen if you go back even to the time of Queen Elizabeth I. So there we go. Tyranny, socialism, palace intrigue. Then you can think about the corruption through society. A lot of these people that have been totally corrupt are going to jail, and this is going to happen on an international basis. I mean, get your head around that for a moment. So you're going to see some major changes, and that is all. A lot of it is going to come out in the next month. I'm doing this on January the 31st, 2021, and I'm expecting the next month to be mind-boggling and shocking, and the things that are going to come out are just unbelievable. Even though I know about these cycles, I've, of course, never been through a 1,000-year cycle top, I am just blown away at the changes that we're going to see. It is absolutely incredible, and some of it's bad. The larger part of it is good. When it's all over and we go through some pain, we are going to have a much better world. Much better. I can't tell you how good this is going to be. Anyway, that's the good going forward. So we've got all of this corruption. We're going to clean that up. We've got propaganda. Don't listen to the mainstream media because they're all lying to you. That is going to change. Loss of freedom of speech. That's pretty, I mean, I have to be very careful about what I say in these videos because they can get taken down very easily if they don't like. If I start talking about vaccines, for example, this is just going away. We're going to have a new financial system I've already alluded to. We are going to have deflation, and we are going to have a lot of truth, and big discoveries always come out at these cycle tops. And that's important to know because I'm going to give you an example of that going forward. I'm afraid we're going to have a civil war. We might be able to escape it, but generally you have a civil war during these periods. And there's a lot of fear because we also have low birth rates at these cycle tops, which really gives us an idea or tells us that our testosterone levels are very low. And testosterone levels, when they're low, means that cortisol is at a high, and that is fear. All right, so fear starts to take over, and it's a rational fear, and this is worldwide right now, and that's why this whole pandemic, because it isn't one, is making people absolutely crazy, and there's a tremendous amount of fear. So, you know, the powers that be are playing on that, and it will play itself out very quickly. So let's go to my chart of part 1. This is the same chart I introduced then, and this is the work of, well, this is not the work of Dr. Wheeler. His work is a little bit more intricate. This is the GISP2 data, and that data came out in the 1990s, and it's from ice cores in Greenland. And so what they did, Greenland ice cores, and that says that at the top here, of course. And so Dr. Wheeler did the same work in the 1930s and early 40s, and he used tree rings. This work was done by 3 countries in the 1990s who went to Iceland, and they came up with the same data, and it gave us the exact same information that Dr. Wheeler came up with. And so I have 2 sources for the same data, which gives you a pretty clear idea that this is actually real. I put some things on the chart here just to give you an idea of the overall traits that you see. For example, international wars as the, let me just explain this for anybody that doesn't know this chart. This is temperature. All right, so the blue line is temperature back about 2,000 years. This goes back to actually 4,000 years. What am I talking about? So it's 2,000 years to here. This would be the top of Rome, and about another 2,000 years to here, which was the top 2007 of the market, actually, and there's a story there. But this is the temperature climate all through these ages. And you can see that it's a sine wave. Generally, it goes up and then it comes down, and then it goes up and then it comes down. And these are generally about 1,000-year periods between these arrows at the top. Here's the top of the Roman Empire. We had Julius Caesar, JC1, and Jesus Christ, JC2. And one of the things you always have, or that usually you have, at the tops of some of these cycles is a change in religion. We have, for example, Jesus Christ, which gave us Christianity. At the top of this cycle, we had Mohammed here, which gave us Islam. So that is at the top of this cycle just after Justinian, and he was the ruler at that time. So every time that our climate gets warmer, very hot, we have major civilizations that come to a high. So here we have ancient Egypt, and here we have Greece, and then Rome took over Greece. And then when it got colder and drier, Rome fell apart, it self-destructed. And then we have a lesser high here, which we had the Byzantium Empire, at the top of that in here. Then we went into a dark age as it got colder and drier here. So there were two periods within this colder, drier period, and sometimes you get that. And within this colder, drier period, we really just had sort of one major period with highs at each of these 172-year periods. And you always see, for example, this was the 977 was the high in terms of hot and dry. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 2007. Each of these periods are 172 years. So we had 6 periods at 172 years. And many of them give us highs. Here's a high here just after 1492. And then we had a Maunder minimum down here at 1664. Just about that, a little bit later than that, actually. But at the same time, we had the British and Spanish empires right here. And what we're going to do is go right to this little area in here, which was the English Empire. And I'm just going to zoom in and look at that period, because this is a 172-year cycle top, but within what we would call the Little Ice Age, or what we would call historically the Dark Ages. So, you know, as the world is opening up, they're becoming less dark, but it's still kind of a negative time where we have, during these periods, we have an awful lot of pandemics that happen, although I wouldn't consider what we've gone through now a pandemic, because we're not at the bottom. When we get to the bottom of these cycles, the real bottoms in here, we tend to have much larger pandemics. So we will get some of those going forward. But this period is important because the pattern that we went through during that period, well, we didn't, although some people would argue that I may have been alive during that period. but they're very similar to what we're going through today. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on. Now, keep in mind that we are at the top of a very dry, hot period, and we're turning colder and drier. So this is the top. It's the top of the American Empire. And as it gets colder and drier, the American Empire will start to disintegrate, and that's what you're seeing. So even though we're going to have, very similar to maybe the Pax Romana at the top of Rome, a very good period for a few years, it is rapidly then, or not rapidly, I suppose slowly in terms of time over the next 500 years, going to get colder and drier. So let's go to that period now. Here we are at a chart of the top of the English Empire, and here's the year 1600. And what you're seeing with these little gray delineations these are theoretical 172-year cycles. All right, so that's 172-year, beginning of a new one at 1492, beginning of a new one at 1664, and this is 172 years in between the two of them. So in actual fact, if you go back exactly 500 years, 515, which is a half a cycle, that would take you to 1492. So this high in terms of temperature, now your temperature is in red, that's the red line, and rainfall is in green. So this came a little bit later than the halfway point in the downward cycle. All right, so 500 years would be that. Half of 1030 is actually the 1,000 year, the length of the 1,000 year cycle, and then halfway would have been 515 years. 1492 plus 515 is 2007, and that actually hit the top in the stock market, and then the central bankers got involved, and they've kept the market up for about another 14 years or so until where we are now, but it is also topping. So keeping all that in mind, you always have large events happening right at the cycle delineations, this sort of being a mid-cycle. And of course, we had Christopher Columbus at 1492 discovering the New World. And so that happened here. We had the Bonfire of the Vanities, which happened right about on the cusp here, and a few years later. And that was in Italy when the powers that be got a whole bunch of people to burn all of their, well, not all of them, but a major number of their books and a lot of antiquities, a lot of art. And that's very similar to what is happening today in terms of both the propaganda and also our freedom of speech, which is disappearing at the moment. And you find that that is something that happens at the tops of these cycles. For example, you could not publish a book during Elizabeth I's time when she was queen, because you could publish a book, but it needed to be stamped or confirmed by the empire in order for it to be published. So they controlled the dialogue of the day, and that changed gradually as it started getting colder and drier, and I've gone through that before. Very much like the stock market, when you get to a high, you have a lot of ups and downs, and you have people that are very bullish and you have people that are very bearish. And until the bearish side takes over, and here until we actually get into the temperature going downhill and also the rainfall, you have this sort of up and down, and it's not a very clear time. And you have that in terms of what's happening on a very large scale with the opposing forces like the Pope versus the monarch. You had the Roman Catholic Church, which was the all-powerful body at that time. In fact, if you go back, and I'm going to show you this in another slide coming up, this period here was when we had Henry VIII, who, because he didn't like the marriage he was in, and he couldn't get the Pope in Rome to disavow that marriage, then he created the Church of England, and he said, well, we're not going to listen to the Roman Catholic Church anymore. And the Roman Catholic Church, of course, was ticked off. And this went on all during this period. And you will see it's very much like the deep state against the Trump organization or the normal people, the populists. And that is going on in today's world, and it is huge. So we've got that conflict going on. We had another one with the Roman Catholics and the Protestants, which you're going to see through the kings and queens, because during this period, some of them were Protestant and some of them were Roman Catholics. And so they would burn heretics at the stage, depending on who was in power. And you get these ups and downs, like I said, with the stock market. You get that in society as well, as these things are battling out until you get a clear winner and all the truth comes out. So the truth always comes out at the tops of these cycles. And then, of course, we had the divine right. So a lot of these kings and queens believed that the divine right was all important, and they fought against Parliament. Parliament was really formed during the time, again, of Henry VIII. And this was, Parliament sort of went up and down until in a period in here with Oliver Cromwell, Parliament actually got dissolved for a period and then brought back again. So that was a constant conflict all during this period until of course, it got colder and drier, and Parliament and democracy started to come back again. So that's one of the clear traits and the turn in that trait. So what I'm showing here, other than these period clashes, are the people that were involved in the Golden Age. Now you can think this was Henry VIII, and I'm going to show Henry VIII up in here on the next chart. But this is very similar this pattern of temperature and rainfall, not rainfall as much as temperature, to what we have today. So we had a recession in the 1970s when we had, of course, presidents like Nixon and Carter, and some of those were considered failures. You get that when you get a colder, drier temperature, which is, or colder, drier period of climate, which is what we had during that time of Henry VIII, which was a very unsettled time, and he burned a whole bunch of people at the stakes. At the stake during that period. But you can think of it also as the temperature is starting to get better up in here, grow warmer, and also we're getting more rainfall, and we're going into a very good period that way, and the top of an empire. This is very much like spring during during the year that we have the normal 4 seasons, that everybody is inspired. We're ready to sort of break out. It's the time of love. It's a golden age. And so our golden age, pretty well at the same time, was the Beatles. It was actually in sort of in this period, the Beatles and all that great music. And then you had this, we had a little bit of disco here, and then we had more great music, but it started to die out. We don't have the wonderful music we had from people like Elton John and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all of these people. There are other periods that are golden ages. There was one in the early 1800s, which of course was the great composers, where you got people like Beethoven and Tchaikovsky, and all of those people tended to be all around the same time. And so there is a reason for these golden ages to break out. So that pretty well takes you through the key thing. Oh, let me just show you one other. We had Leonardo da Vinci during this golden age. We had Michelangelo. We had Shakespeare, of course, from 1564 to 1616. And it's interesting to see that all of his comedies and the light-hearted plays of his were in the warm, wet period. And then when it turned colder, his later plays all ended up being tragedies. So things start to turn dark. It affects the way we feel, the social mood, when it starts to get colder and drier. And so that happened all during this period, and we went into civil wars. The same sort of thing happened with Galileo, and of course he decided that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that went against the church. And he was fine during this period because he was born the same year that Shakespeare was. But in 1642, I think it was 1633, as a matter of fact, he determined that, or he went up against the Roman Catholic Church that did not want the Earth to be the center of or believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and Galileo believed that it was not. And he ended up going to jail, or he was put in confinement during that period. But that only happened after things turned colder. All right, so you get this negative mood, and that is what is starting to turn today. And one of the things that you're seeing happen is that the Trump organization is going after the cabal that has been in power behind the scenes for really centuries, and very much more so during the last 100 years, and a lot of them are going to jail. So the truth comes out. The bad guys are put in jail typically. In this case, it was Galileo, who was not a bad guy, but it tends to be a very negative period during when it gets colder and drier, and that's what you're going to see. But it is good for our freedom, because freedom starts to come back during this. You can see habeas corpus here in the Bill of Rights. You always get these things happening at the turn when you start to get colder and drier, and it happens over time. We also had the bubonic plague here in the Fire of London, so this was at a period where things are starting to get very difficult, and it is a negative mood, and you do tend to get the plague and a lot of pandemics, but not until it turns a lot colder and drier than it is now. And so when we got this little pandemic, I said right off the bat, I said, this doesn't make any sense, because it was at the top of a warm, yes, warm, dry period, but it had not turned colder. The other thing was that the stock market was at a high, which tells me that social mood is at a high. So those things contributed to my thinking that, okay, this is not real. And of course, that's what it's turned out to be. It's turned out to be part of the tyranny that we're experiencing at the top here. So moving ahead, we'll just plug in the kings and queens of that era. So here is Henry VIII, and that was the period of the Reformation, where he founded the Church of England, which was Protestant, and until that time, the Roman Catholic Church had been involved. I mean, everything was Roman Catholic, and of course the Pope was really at the top of the world. That was the power in the world to that time, and that conflict went on for a very long period of time. And in fact, it is still going on today, because if you look at the origins of this cabal, it really comes from the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the things that we have at the top of the cycle that we're in right now is a conspiracy of pedophilia that has been going on for decades, and that is the other thing that is going to be destroyed. And it's going to take some time to do that, but we've made some great strides in that area. So the atrocities that you get, they burned a lot of people at the stake in these times for their views on religion. They also killed a lot of people, lopped off their heads, and it was a very extreme period that way. And we're going to actually see some of that in the period coming up that we're going into. And I think during March, you're going to be seeing an awful lot of people come to trial and for treason and those types of things. And that is something that we would see as it is turning colder and drier. And yes, it is actually turning colder and drier now, so we expect to see the truth come out. The other thing is that I will go back just one slide here. Galileo was responsible for deciding that, I mentioned the Earth not being the center of the universe. And you find that we get an awful lot of discoveries during this period as it turns colder and drier. And you can go back to Aristotle in about 350 BC, which was again just after a high in temperature. And he believed that the Earth was not flat, that it was round. And so that was another major discovery that happened at the same time in this cycle as it happened way back when. So going back to our period here, if you were to go through all of these different people that they had in government and in the monarchy at that time, we had Henry VIII, and then he was followed by his son Edward V, or sixth rather. He was not in power for very long. He was very young, just really in his teens, and then he died. But he was a Protestant and followed with Henry VIII. And then Bloody Mary, which was another one of Henry VIII's many children, ended up, well, not many children, he had many wives, and he had a few children, but many of them died in birth, and that was a problem for him. But Bloody Mary came to power, and Bloody Mary was Roman Catholic, so everybody that was Protestant became a heretic, and she was known for burning almost 300 people at the stake during her period of reign, which again was not very long. It was only 5 years, but she's very well known for that. And then we got another daughter of good old Henry, and that was Elizabeth I, who reigned for a very long period of time, and she was one of the longest reigning monarchs. And she was very, well, she allowed both Roman Catholic and Protestant, but she was a little more Protestant than Roman Catholic, but she allowed both of them to exist, and there weren't as many, or there weren't very many, if at all. There were a few burning at the stakes. You tend to get into witches during this period, and as it gets colder and drier, people don't think very well, and that's another trait of these cycle tops. So here we have James I, who was next in line, and he was actually the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, during Elizabeth's time, we can get into palace intrigue that typically happens at the top. If you can think of the top, for example, of the Roman Empire, we have the killing of Julius Caesar at that period, and there was all kinds of intrigue. If you read the Roman history right at the top, you have the same sort of thing here, where we had Mary Queen of Scots, who had to escape from Scotland. I won't go into that history, but she ended up being in England. And she, if Elizabeth I did not have any kids, she would have been next in line to the throne. And James I was actually her son, and that's who ended up being the next in line, because Elizabeth I thought that Mary Queen of Scots was a threat, and she obviously was, and had her head lopped off towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. So she was no longer around, but James I then became the next in line, and James, of course, gave you the James I version of the Bible. And he was known for that more than anything else. He was also responsible for the killing of Walter Raleigh. And Walter Raleigh, of course, was responsible for the British Navy and all of the wins that they had over a period of time, and was a favorite of Elizabeth I. But again, things turned dark and cold, and a very negative mood. James I ended up killing Sir Walter Raleigh. Another thing that happened with Elizabeth I here was at the end of her reign in 1588. She died in 1603. At the end of the reign, they had the Spanish Armada. So Spain was actually, before this period, was the empire of the day. It was the empire of the previous 172 years, but it was dying. And actually, they had about 100 years of bankruptcies coming into this period. But they decided to attack England, and the Spanish Armada was set up in 1588 during Elizabeth's reign. And she's very famous for a speech that she gave, actually, supposedly at the time of the Spanish Armada. It was actually after they had already won that war, but the propaganda came out that she had given this and told England that she was standing up for them, but that battle had already passed. So you get the winners of this period all the time who write the history, and that's why there are problems with some historical data and what people have written about the history, because it is always the winner that gets to write it. And an example of that was that a year later than this, there was the English Armada, and the English Armada, it was when England actually attacked Spain, went into their harbor, and England lost all their ships. It was a complete disaster. So the Spanish Armada was a complete disaster for Spain, and it got written up as a big win for England, but nobody ever talks about the English Armada, because England ended up being the empire of the day, and so they got to write the history. And you can go look that up, and you will find, even if you Google it, you will find the English Armada of the next year. So it's interesting how these things play out. Then we had Charles I, which was the son of James I. He was a divine right king and fought with the Parliament all through his reign. And he ended up really causing the British Civil Wars at that time, because he fought with Parliament. And so Oliver Cromwell ended up being in charge of the army, and eventually won a battle against Charles I and had him executed. And then they went into a period called the Council of State, where Oliver Cromwell ended up being the Lord Protector. So they had no king or queen. So this is the transition that you're slowly getting between Parliament becoming more powerful and this absolute monarchy losing its power over time. And that happened as it got colder and drier during this period. So Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, and he eventually died, and then they had a problem with the throne, and they asked Charles II to take over. And Charles II was already the King of Scotland at that time. He was very tolerant of the Church of England, and so there weren't any major heresy trials or burning at the stake during this period. He fought Parliament as well, and eventually dissolved it. And he had no kings by his wife or and also, but outside of his marriage, he had about 12 kids. So he was kind of a happy-go-lucky guy at the top of this monarchy, at the top of the English Empire. So then we had James II, who came into power, and he was the brother of Charles II, and he was a Catholic and a tyrant. And he believed very strongly in the divine right of kings, and he fought with Parliament big time. And he eventually had to flee, as if I remember correctly. And the Parliament asked William and Mary, who were related to Charles I. They were heads of the Dutch Republic, and they asked them to come to England and take over the monarchy. And that's what happened during that period. It's what they refer to as the Glorious Revolution, because they did not actually have a revolution. There was no bloodshed during this period. It was an amicable change to a new monarchy during that period. And during all of this period, you get the habeas corpus and Bill of Rights that would come, and that came out of Parliament as the people started to get more power. And that's what you're going to see happen over the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years, is the people will get more power and they will win over the tyranny. And so you will also get the American Empire, which will start to have less power in the world. And gradually over the next 500 years, the power is going to move to the east of the world, to the Chinas and the Russias. But it's interesting, we have a period where China is trying to take over, and they're way ahead of their time. So they're starting to fall apart. They will be less powerful. They will not win this war. The U.S. will win this war that they're having with the deep state and China, and they will become out more powerful. But over time, as it gets colder and drier, the U.S. will start to disintegrate. So there you go. This got colder and drier and got into the Maunder minimum, which was the bottom of that. They consider about 1715, which is really about here. And then it started to get warmer and wetter. So if you look at the bigger picture, and this is the same period, but I've taken out most of the monarchs. I'll just take you through what happens, what tends to happen. At the tops here, you have corruption, propaganda, tyranny, high debt levels. Well, that was true of England. In fact, people laud Elizabeth I because she started up being about $250,000 in debt, and she ended up being $500,000 in debt at the end of her reign. They expected that, or they say that is a good thing. Well, she still created more debt, and that was a problem for Parliament going forward. You have palace intrigue and treason. Well, there was Mary Queen of Scots against Elizabeth I, and Mary Queen of Scots had about 3 major plots, and eventually after the third one, they just decided to lop off her head and get rid of her. So that was going on all during Elizabeth I's reign. You know that during Donald Trump's reign at the top here, we've had the Russiagate problem, we've had the Ukraine Gate problem. There's actually been 6 assassination attempts against him, and I think we just had a 7th one in the last couple of days, as I understand it. So that is the same kind of trait that you have at the top of these cycles. Our loss of freedom of speech. As it turns colder and drier, you get some flooding. We've already had usually have a little period of and you can see it here, very damp, but the temperature starts to go down. So colder and wetter for a short period of time until the wetness starts to catch up and it becomes drier. So we had flooding, if you can remember that, over the last 3 to 4 years. We had major floods in the U.S. We've had them in Europe. We certainly had them in central Canada, where I'm in western Canada, but we had them in central Canada, and we always get that, and they tend to destroy the cropland. And so we have seen that in the U.S., and as it gets colder and drier, we're also going to have food problems going forward. So it is good to stock up and start to learn how to farm and create a garden, because those things are going to be very much needed over the next, now I'm talking over a very long period of time, but we are going to have some problems in the next 10 to 20 years, even as we are going to have a crash in the stock market during that period, and that will take down a lot of businesses. So you're seeing these days a lot of people moving from the urban areas, which are going to become hotbeds of violence, and they're moving to the country to get closer to food and water, and that is a good plan going forward. We're going to have a financial depression, but we're also going to have a revolution in just about everything. So you're going to learn over the next month about people that you thought were dead that actually have faked their deaths, and to get away from the cabal, because this has been a period where we've had the cabal that are trying to keep people in line, and they are, and with a lot of money from China at the same time, and so people have not really been free. We haven't been free for a very long period of time. You can think of 9/11 and lining up at the airport and being searched. That's not freedom, folks. And the same sorts of things happen at the tops of these depressions. So we are going to go into a revolution. We may not have a civil war, but they're always prevalent. It's just some of the things that they're trying to do right now with a new financial system. And you can look this up. It's called Nasara, Gesara, and I think I've got that on another chart coming. That is a system we're going to try and be put in place. We're trying to get rid of the cabal and the central bankers. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of what's happening in the U.S., but as of January the 20th of this year, 2021, the corporation, which was the U.S., and that was centered around Washington, D.C., has been dissolved, and the U.S. is currently under military rule. And once that is done and the cleanup is done, you're actually going to have a new president in the U.S., and the republic from 1870 will be restored again. And so the next president is actually going to be the 19th president of the United States. So there's a whole story there, and as things clear up in terms of our ability to put information on YouTube and not have it taken down, I'll be doing more videos about that transition. And that's coming up pretty shortly. I think in the next month, we're going to see a lot more freedom of speech, as it turns out, and we get a gradual return to democracy. So that's kind of what happens, and that's what's happening this time. And so it's really quite a spectacular time. I can't tell you the importance of this period that you're going to believe it. This is a major turn in the world, and you're going to be absolutely shocked at some of the things that are coming out. Here's our financial system. I put a little bank in here. We had the Bank of England, which was founded in 1694, and behind that, of course, were the Rothschild family, and that developed our financial system that we've had up until this day. With the dissolution, in actual fact, the USA Corporation is in bankruptcy court. With the dissolution of that, it actually breaks the contract with the Federal Reserve, which, of course, is a set of independent banks, and it is controlled by the Rothschild family. And there's actually indictments against that entire family that are going to play out. So our financial system is going to change dramatically. There is going to be something called, what they're working towards is Nasara, Gesara. Nasara is national and Gesara is global, but it is getting rid of taxes. It is getting rid of all of our debt, and you're going to see them work through that in the next few years. So it's a major turning point in society. It's eventually all good, but we're going to have some tough times because I still see a depression happening, and maybe it'll be shorter because of a new financial system. But if you look at Europe and what happened with Europe and getting in the euro, that took a good 10 years to change currencies all across the European Union. And this is going to be worldwide, this Nasara, Gesara. You can go search for that and get some information on what the plans are. It's been out there for a while, but unfortunately, all the original documents have been under seal. So we don't know 100% what is in this or what the plans are, but there's an awful lot of information out there on it, and you can make that decision for yourself. So getting back to the 4,000 year chart here of my 172 year tops, which are all of these numbers here, and then the 1,000 year tops, which are my red arrows. And you can see that we had major civilizations at the tops of these, and we're at another major civilization, which is going to start to disintegrate as it gets colder and drier. But that takes a long time. This low came in about 700 years after the top. So, and these ones they're all differing when you get into these dark age periods. So you have ups and downs. I'm just going to take a quick look at this period here, which is the top of Greece, because I want to make one point about that, the top of Greece, and that's this point. Here we are looking at the top of Greece, the Greek climax, warmer and wetter. And here we have Aristotle that decided that the earth was flat, or sorry, the earth was round rather. Before that time, everybody believed it was flat. Actually, Pythagoras, I don't have his name on, there he is. Pythagoras had come up with the idea that the earth was round, but it was Aristotle that actually believed it, but it didn't come in until after we had turned to the downside. So all of the truth, all of the science, we're going to have some major discoveries. One of them is the med beds that are coming out that are going to replace our medical system. And this really comes from the idea in this very fake medical system that we've had, that they are treating us with drugs because we are mostly made of water. Well, in actual fact, we are human beings that are electrical. And so these med beds that are coming out are going to be able to fix a lot of our problems by just getting in the bed, and they're going to fix them from treating our bodies as electrical elements, electrical beings, and so we're going to see that happen. So this is a very important period in history, and you're living through a period of history, and you're going to see dramatic changes. So for more on this, you can go to my site, worldcyclesinstitute.com, where I post a lot of blog posts that are for free. I also have the truthsage.com, which is a subscription site, which is where I tell you how to stay in a thriving world of your own during the major changes in the new economy. Because we've had 100 years and more of inflation, we're going to have deflation, and that's going to affect your wealth and your assets and your money. And if you don't know what that means, that could hurt you quite a bit. So I teach about that in this website called thetruthsage.com. I am going to spend a lot of time on the future of medicine and show you about, give you information on some of the natural substances that you can use. Because again, the pharmaceutical industry has been all about making money. They have been creating a lot of diseases because a lot of these vaccines are not effective. These latest ones are not safe. And so you've got a pharmaceutical industry that has been preying on you. All of that is going to change over the next 10 years. And gradually we're going to see things called med beds that are going to come out, and we're going to get rid of the bad guys that are at the top of the pharmaceutical industry. You can consider them part of the 1%. So there is a radical change. It is a war between good and evil. It happened during the English Empire in the early 1600s and late 1500s. It is happening today at the top of this 1,000-year cycle. So that is a deep dive into the Virgin Queen period to show you that what is happening today is the same pattern that happened to a smaller degree in the 1600s, early 1600s. And the idea that we're just seeing kind of a minor change is crazy, because some of the things that you're going to see over even the next 2 months in terms of the truth coming out are going to be absolutely stunning and shocking. And there is a period right now where we're getting rid of this pedophilia. There are hundreds of thousands of kids that have been affected, have been captured and kept underground for decades. It's absolutely horrific. So this is, again, another warm, dry period was during Hitler's time in the 1930s, late 1930s. And of course, you had the atrocities there. We have the same atrocities here, except this is huge compared to what happened in the 1930s. So that's just a heads up that we are in a good time going forward. We are going to have a new world. The old world is dying, but in a lot of cases, this old world, it takes a little bit of work to really kill it and kill some of the people that have been in charge and making it a very tyrannical period for us that's gone on for a very long period of time. So with that, I'll have more of these coming out. I'm expecting to get part 2, which followed part 1, which may be a little bit longer than this. I'm expecting to get that out by the end of the next week. So there's more coming. Some of it has to do with my ability to say what I think and what I know and not get taken down off YouTube. So hopefully this one will last, and this gives you a little bit more information on cycles and how they determine the future.